You clicked on this video, so I guess I owe it to you to tell me about my vice. What can I say? I've been drinking 3 to 5 cups a day recently. Mainly white tea as well as some black and some green, iced and hot, and... Oh, right. Sorry, you meant this vice. Well, I kind of figured it out as I was going along, so the first minute or so of what you're about to see will be not the most informative, but hopefully this can still give anyone who wants to build one of these leg vices for themselves a rough idea of the procedure to follow to come up with something that works pretty damn smoothly. Oh yeah, I also have absolutely no idea what I'm doing. I'm just figuring stuff out. Let's get to it. So I marked out 30 millimeters below the hole that the threaded rod is going to run through and squared off a line from that, as well as a matching line 30 millimeters up from the bottom of the vice chop. And then because I'm using this 25 millimeter tube steel for the mechanism, I then measured out on those lines 25 millimeters either side of the center of the vice chop. Hopefully that makes sense. So I then use those pencil marks to set my marking gauge to the right length, depth, whatever word you want to use there, and then just scored out lines on either side of the vice chop all the way down. Oh yeah, and I also just scribbled all over the waist area with a pencil to make sure I don't accidentally cut out the wrong part. Now, as with everything in woodworking, there are a plethora of methods you could use to cut this slot out, just depending on what tools you have access to. And I would say probably the best method is going to be an upcut spiral bit chucked into a plunge router, and then using an edge guide to keep it even on both sides. However, I do not have a plunge router, nor do I have a guide for the router I do have, so I'm going to stick with a cordless drill with a big-ass Forstner bit and some good old-fashioned chisel work. Now, even though I said I was going to be using a cordless drill here, which I am, I'm also using a vertical drill guide, and these are so nice. If you don't have one of these, I highly recommend picking one up. You can get nicer ones than this, but this is super useful, especially with Forstner bits for stuff like this, to keep it nice and straight so the bit doesn't rattle around, also so that you can overlap them and get a nice straight channel. And you can see here what I mean with it being overlapped. You end up with a channel all the way through, rather than just individual holes stacked right next to each other. But that does not mean that we're completely free of chisel work, so I locked the chop of this vise into my tail vise and got to work on the chisel work. And I've said chisel work a lot of times in this video, but I think everyone pretty much universally agrees that sanding is not fun, but chisels, I enjoy using chisels, so I enjoyed this. I should probably also mention at some point that I did have to go back and cut out a matching channel completely identical to that one in the leg of the workbench. But anyway, back to the vise chop. You can see here now that the two pieces of tube steel fit perfectly in that channel with a nice loose fit. However, I forgot to account for this bolt that's going to hold them together in the middle, so I just took a smaller Forstner bit and drilled out a little spot for that to go into as a relief area, and I of course had to flip the bench back over and do the same thing there, just like I did with the original slot. And now you can kind of get a visual idea of how this basically scissor mechanism is going to work, but I haven't actually showed you how I built the mechanism itself yet, so let's get to that. To start, I cut down 2 pieces of 25mm or 1-inch tube steel to this length right here, which is just a few millimeters shorter than the slot I cut out in both the chop of the vise and the bench back in the woodworking portion of this project. And that's just so that I have a tiny bit of wiggle room to fit everything in there, and I'm not trying to make it fit perfectly. But once I had those 2 pieces cut, I brought them over to the workbench and just found the center on both of them and then marked out with an automatic center punch and drilled out a hole. Now this hole is going to be 1/4 inch in diameter because that is the diameter of this bolt that I'm going to use to hold them together. The hole can be any size you want really, just a nice snug fit for whatever you're going to use to bind these 2 pieces together. And somehow I got ahead of myself and forgot to record it, but I also drilled out 1/4 inch holes just like that at the top of each of these pieces, which is what I'm going to use to secure them into the bench later on. Speaking of which, what I'm doing right here is marking out a line that I can drill a hole to that aligns with the holes that I just showed you in those steel bars. So a piece of metal is going to go through both the wood chop and those bars, that way I can hold it in place. And you'll see what I mean here in a second, but I just drilled out a 1/4 inch hole with a Forstner bit through each side of the vise chop. But before I can actually get to that, I need to round over the corners on these steel bars so that they can move smoothly in the corners. So to do that, I just took a roll of electrical tape and scratched a line through some Dicam. You could also just use a marker or a pencil for this. I just took the opportunity to use Dicam because Dicam. But once I had that marked out, I took it over to my very much falling apart belt grinder, and just worked down the corners. So now that that issue is fixed, and I'm not going to show you, you just need to trust me that it's fixed, and I definitely did not have to go back and grind more off two more times. Definitely didn't have to do that. So now I can cut down some of this 1/4 inch brass rod, and you can see here what I'm talking about with that hole, that 1/4 inch hole through the side of the vise chop, and I'm just using some nuts here to act as a spacer. They aren't actually working as nuts. And then I'm going to put that bar in there and just hammer this brass piece through to the other side. And as per usual, once that was done, I had to take it over to the leg of the bench and just do the exact same thing. And this was quite a struggle. I struggled with it for a bit until I finally figured out I had to both pick up the vise chop and then also kind of angle it in because I didn't get that hole very straight. And I know at this point you're probably wanting to, hey, see the vise in action, but I'm not going to let you. Instead, I'm going to cut down a piece of this 1-inch dowel that's going to be used as the handle and start working on the handle. I'm also going to use some of these rubber leg tips as caps on either end. A lot of people will fashion these out of wood with their lathe. However, I don't have a lathe, and even if I did, I kind of prefer the rubber on these. But I do want to change the color of this dowel to match the other handle on my other vise, my tail vise at the other end of my workbench, so I just laid down some paper on the bench so that it doesn't get all messed up, and got to work staining the dowel. I just gave it a rub down with a paper towel. I'm not really being finicky with this, it's just for my workbench. It doesn't need to look very nice. Just a change in color is all I'm looking for here. And these rubber tips actually already had a dot in the center of them from when they were molded, so I used that as a marker to drill out a hole perfectly centered and then put them on and used that as a guide to drill into the dowel. That way I didn't have it kind of holding there guessing where the center was going to be, and then I just screwed them onto the ends of the dowel with some of these Craig pocket hole screws. You could use anything you like here, don't even need to be secured really, but I like the look of these flat washer heads on these screws. And once that was done, I just gave it all rubbed down with a dry paper towel just to get off any excess stain that was still lying around on there. And for my next attempt to keep you watching until the end of the video, I'm going to tackle this issue, which is that the chop of the vise is currently making direct contact with the side of my workbench, so I'm going to pad that with some of this leather I've had laying around specifically for this purpose. Now, leather workers, look away. Anyone who has any experience with leather, please look away. This is my first time ever doing anything with leather, so I am cutting it with a Kiridashi and a ruler. I'm marking it out with a pencil. It's not good, but I'm doing it, it works, and I'm just going to cover the back of this in wood glue and stick it to the side of the bench. And I did say this was my first time ever doing anything with leather, however that is not completely true. I have actually attached a strop to a wooden block before, so I know that wood glue is going to be plenty strong to keep this held in place. And on that note, it's time to put it in place, and I don't know if you can actually see it here, but I did actually go and mark out a couple of pencil lines down the side of the bench telling me how far either direction to put it, and then I just lined it up with the top of the workbench. And then I just used the vise to hold it in place until the glue dried. And here you finally have it, the vise mechanism in action. You can see how it works with it being pinned in place at the top, but the bottom halves are free to float around, but it does still have an issue. So you can see if I apply pressure with just one finger laterally against the side of the vise, it does not rock at all going in or out. However, if I take that finger off and try to move it, it knocks all over the place. Now, this is being caused by the ability of this threaded rod that's moving the chop back and forth to rock around inside both the leg of the workbench as well as the chop where it's secured in on the other side. So I had to take this apart, which is kind of a pain. It's not really meant to be taken apart, and figure out a plan to fix it. Okay, so my original plan was to just leave it like this, rattling all over the place, and maybe get to it sometime down the line, but I know if I don't do it now, I just won't get it done. It'll be one of those things that 5 years from now I'm still saying, yeah, I'm gonna get that done at some point. So Instead, I'm going to follow after what Neil Paskin did in his follow-up video to the pinless leg vise he made, I don't know, something like 6 years ago now. And I'm going to take some of these walnut scraps I have left over from when I did the joinery in the legs to my workbench, and I'm going to cut them down to 50mm lengths and then cut out a corresponding hole around the pre-existing hole in both the chop and the leg of my bench, and then just embed those in so that they basically squeeze around the threaded rod that moves the vise in and out, and I hope that makes sense. If it didn't, just watch what I'm about to do. Now, instead of go to the hassle of just restating what I just told you on camera in voiceover form, I'm going to take this opportunity to do less work and just not do a voiceover for this portion of the video. Well, there you have it. It is working quite well. The only thing I would change if I did this over is I would probably use a thicker wall tubing for the actual mechanism down here. It still works great, but if you need to really apply some torque, it can bend inwards a little bit. But that's not a big deal. All in all, I am happy with this, and if you're looking to build something similar to this, hopefully this video gave you some ideas and a good reference of how you can do that. If you did find this video helpful, leave it a like, and I will see you with the next issue I have.